All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We are going to do the famous Zoom awkward pause as we let folks come in. So thank you for joining us. People are coming in pretty steadily, so we're going to get them just about a minute. But we're excited to talk to you about how college applications are evaluated. So hang tight. And for those of you just joining us, thanks for coming. We are just taking a few more seconds to let folks come on in here to the Zoom room. We'll get started in just a second or so. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is Inside the Admissions Office, how college applications are evaluated. So we want to start by just telling you a little bit about who we are and what we do here at Collegewise. At Collegewise, we create stress-free college search and application processes and journeys for students and families. We've been around for over 20 years. We were started by our founder, Kevin, just one person, meeting with students and their families at the kitchen table, and we've grown to a company. We have over 80 counselors, we have tons of tutors, and we have lots of folks whose primary mission is to take the stress out of the college search and application process. So in these 20 plus years, we've had thousands upon thousands of students admitted to college. Our goal is really to help students search for colleges and build a list where they can find a place that is a great fit for them academically, socially, and financially. The stat that I sort of like the best here is that combined, we have over 500 years of admissions experience. And we come from all over the admissions landscape, both as admissions officers from universities and college counselors based in schools, all here to support folks like you turning in. So that is who we are. We would love to get a sense of who you are as well. So we're going to launch a poll right now. If you could let us know who you are, if you're a student or a parent, and what grade you are or what grade your student is in. That will help us out. So please answer that poll that just popped up. And just a reminder, we would love it if you asked us questions. So we're going to be talking to you about the college application review process, but this session will also be recorded. So recording will come to your email within a day or so after this presentation. And then there's a Q&A box. So if you want to ask any questions throughout this presentation, please put them in the Q&A. We will get to them as we go. And that is the housekeeping. You can turn on closed captions if that is helpful for you on your screen. So I'm going to give you a high-level overview of what we're talking about today, and then we're going to jump in, introduce ourselves, and get into the topic. So we want to start with giving you a high-level overview of the admissions landscape and some terms that are important. And then we're going to go through elements of the application that admissions officers are focusing on. And then we're going to do some deep dives into examples of different types of application review. Myself and all of my colleagues on this webinar, who will introduce themselves in a minute, we've all worked in admissions offices reading applications. So we're going to draw upon that experience to tell you what happens sort of behind this metaphorical curtain, give you some final thoughts. And of course, throughout, we will answer any questions you have. So before I kick it over to my colleagues, I want to introduce myself. My name is Brenna Heinz. I am a college counselor here. I've been at Collegewise for about 2 years. Before Collegewise, my entire career was spent in undergraduate admissions. So I started off my educational journey. I attended Tufts University as an undergrad. I went to Penn for my graduate work, and then I went straight into admissions at MIT. I was there for almost 5 years. Went to grad school, and then I started working at Swarthmore College, which is a small private liberal arts college outside of Philly, before coming to Collegewise. So lots of different types of admissions experience represented here. I am just one person, and I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Caitlin, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Brenna, and thanks to you all for joining us for this webinar. My name is Caitlin Harper. I am based in Oregon, but grew up in Kansas. My own college search was focused entirely on getting out of Kansas, which landed me at Lewis and Clark College, a small private liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. I loved it so much that I decided they couldn't make me leave. I got a job working in the admissions office right out of graduation and proceeded to work in that admissions office for a decade. I did anything and everything you could possibly do in an admissions office and worked my way up. I transitioned eventually during the pandemic to Willamette University, which is another small private liberal arts college just an hour south of Portland. And worked there as a director of admission. Realized that I was having a lot less fun working with spreadsheets and data that represented the students at my institutions, and decided to get back to actually working directly with students, seeing their faces and knowing their stories. And that is what led me to Collegewise.
Hey everyone, my name is Ashley Meyer, and my experience is almost all in the Southeast. I went to undergrad at the University of South Carolina, where I was a tour guide and fell in love with the experience of talking about college. And that led me to a career in admission. Most of what I'll share today, I draw on my experience at Georgia Tech for that. I worked there for many years and read many applications, thousands of applications for students wanting to attend Georgia Tech. And then I had realized I had only worked at or attended large public schools in the Southeast. So I decided to go to Harvard's Graduate School of Education to get my master's in higher ed after my time at Georgia Tech. And then I came back and worked at a private school here in Atlanta for many years as their director of college counseling. But when COVID hit and I had 2 young kids, it was time to make a transition, and Collegewise was the best place for that. And I get to work with students all over the country in their college search to figure out where they want to go and to take stress out of the admission process. I also want to introduce Renee Roush, who is in the Q&A tonight. So what you will see is she has an incredible array of admission experience, from University of Delaware to George Washington in Washington, D.C. to Columbia in New York City. She's read apps for all of these. So the answers you're getting in the Q&A tonight are expert answers, and she is excited for you to hit her with your hardest questions. So please do so. So with that, I'm going to dive into our presentation with a thought experiment for everyone. What I want for you to do is to close your eyes and imagine what happens to an application after the student pushes submit on their application. So just close your eyes and think about where it goes. Some of you may have never thought of this, and you're just picturing a blank internet screen. For some of you, you might know more about computers, so you can actually picture the binary code and what is actually happening to that file. For a lot of you, you may think of it flying magically into the internet and then being printed out to a file that then lands on a mahogany desk with a group of old white men in tweed jackets sitting around and discussing whether the student should get in, a la Legally Blonde law school admission, when they decided to admit Elle Woods. Many of my students have told me that that's what they picture when they think about college admission, because that's the only process they've ever seen in the movies. Our hope for today's presentation is that you take away that that is generally not what happens, and that this process is nuanced from school to school. You're going to hear from Caitlin and myself and Brenna, and you'll hear from Renee in the chat of all the different experiences and admission processes that we had. And you're going to see they're all different because it is a human process, and it is prone to differences because there are different leaders and different people in every office. But what we want you to see is what it is we're looking for and the themes that you can pull out of this that will help you to put your best foot forward when filling out applications. I saw in the poll that most of you are 11th graders, so you're getting ready to do this summer and early next fall. And we hope that we can give you some strong nuggets to take away as you're thinking about starting to fill out those applications. So I want to start with this slide, and this is fair warning that I was a strategy consultant for 1 year, and from that 1 year, I took away a love for complicated PowerPoints, so I'm sorry for that. What this PowerPoint does is it tells you a story, and it tells you how admission works in different scales of selectivity. On a basic level, in this far left column here, you can see that students get into college with just a GPA. At most schools in the United States, if a student takes the required high school curriculum at their high school, and then they get a 2.0 GPA, so essentially C's or better in every class, and then a couple states, they have required test scores, those students are going to get into college, which I hope is a relief for many of you that college is an option if you've got a 2.0 GPA. I know if you are logging on a Tuesday night to hear about college admission, you're probably looking into more selective schools, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. But I never want to forget the fact that there are really good college options out there that do not require the frenzy and the stress and the work we're going to talk about this evening for getting into more selective schools. As you see schools become more and more selective on this chart, they add in the different requirements that they have for what you need to apply to college. So this is an additive chart in the sense that each of these categories requires more and more along the way. So what we're going to do in today's presentation is to break down some of the elements so that you can see how we looked at those as admission officers. Our goal is to put you yourself in the place of an admission officer and to understand the different elements that we considered in an applications. As schools can encounter more applications in their pool, they have to select fewer students and then add requirements to be able to tell the difference between the great applicants that they have. This is the work we do every day at Collegewise, is helping students to understand these nuances and to prepare for the different types of applications that may be in front of them. So that gives you a sense of the landscape. The second thing I want to point out is that selective college admission is a very human process. There are real people reading the applications in front of them. That means that it is a process that's prone to mistakes like bias or bad moods if you're reading a file at the end of a long day. But it's also a process then that's open to connection and stories and relationship and emotional moments of reading an application in front of the admission officers. It's not just about the numbers when applications become more selective. These are real people who will spend their days reading dozens of applications, and over a season will read hundreds or thousands of applications each year. I asked you earlier to picture who you thought would be reading the college application. And what you can see from the data that was collected by NACAC, which is the professional organization that admission officers and college counselors belong to, is that at least 10 years ago when this data was collected, the average person reading the application was a white female in her 20s to 40s. So in other words, the four of us on this webinar, we're the average person reading the file. And the reason I think that's important for you to know is that you want to know your audience when you're writing and when you're creating an application. And to know that the application reviewers are probably closer to the high schooler's age than you would realize. Of course, admission officers, to prevent bias or glaring issues in making admission decisions, no one admission officer will usually make decisions alone. Schools will often review applications several times before they make a final decision through an admission committee or partner reading or something like that. And through the next sections of the presentation, we'll dive into those different sections of the application and how they're considered by admission officers. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Brenna to talk about how the academics section is reviewed.
Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, now we want to get into it. You know, when you are thinking about, okay, my transcript goes into this ether with a bunch of youngish white women, what are they looking at when they're looking at my transcript? Things like that. So the first thing, and this is any college, no matter how selective or how non-selective they are, they care about your courses and grades, because of course you are going to college to get an academic degree. And so the number one question that every student and every admissions officer has to ask themselves is, can I or can this student do the work here? We in admissions are in the business of admitting students who we think will succeed at our institution, because we don't want to admit students who are going to fail or be totally underwater. So you want to think about that too when you're applying to colleges. But what's the nuance here, right? So what are we looking at? One big thing that I want you to take away from this presentation, regardless of if it's about academics or about extracurriculars or about essays, is we as admissions officers are typically evaluating students in the context from which you're coming. So we are not out here comparing every student all over the country to each other and saying, who's best, who's worst. That's not how this process works. So we look at, who are you, where are you coming from? And in the academic space, what opportunities, what classes have been afforded to you? And of those, what have you chosen to take advantage of? So something that is really helpful for you high school students on here is take a look at your high school profile. Now, many of you might be sitting here and being like, what's that? I've never heard of a high school profile. So almost every single high school will have this document that they send to admissions officers, particularly at highly selective colleges who are evaluating you in this really deep way. And it tells us as admissions officers what classes are offered. So we don't sit here and say, every student who gets into MIT must have taken 20 AP classes. Because you know what? Not all students have AP classes available, period. Not all students have 20 AP classes. Maybe you're doing dual enrollment with your high school. Maybe you're in an IB program. Maybe you don't have either of those things. Maybe you're an international student, right? But this school profile tells us what we need to know in order to evaluate your transcript in context. So take, for example, Canyon Crest. It's a school in San Diego. And here's the little section that says what advanced course offerings there are. So you can see here, they have a lot of AP courses. They have around 26 or so, plus they offer dual enrollment, math beyond calculus. So students at Canyon Crest have a lot of academic opportunity. So if I'm evaluating an application from Canyon Crest, I look at this, and then I go to the transcript and I say, okay, given what they have available, what have they chosen to take? So here we have a student who was applying for some engineering degrees and for some data science degrees. And so what I did is I highlighted her AP classes, the total number of AP classes she will have taken by the time she graduates, right? And this is what we see as admissions officers. This is a screenshot of a real transcript. And so you can see here, we have a bunch of 11th grade and earlier grades, and then we have courses in progress. So we know what she's taking senior year. We don't know her grades yet in senior year because she hasn't gotten them. That's the time we evaluate applications. And so this student is taking 13 total AP classes. So in the highly selective admission space, a lot of people would ask me, well, how many do I need to take? Do I need to take all 26 that my high school offers? And the answer to that is no. If you saw that slide before, there were 2 AP, art classes. The student wasn't into that. We would have no expectation that she take those AP art classes. But what we do expect of her, because she's interested in engineering, is to take AP calculus, which she did AP physics 1 or AP calc AB and AP calc BC. and AP Physics, because physics and calculus are kind of the backbone of any engineering degree. And she did that. And the thing to think about is, where is she choosing to have rigor in her schedule? So for students who are really into STEM, we expect you to push the rigor in STEM if it's available to you. If you're someone who's really interested in humanities or social science, maybe you would be taking more of those AP history, AP language classes. So the point here is not that you need to look at your school profile and take every single most advanced AP class there is. That is not, you don't need to do that for MIT. You don't need to do that for Swarthmore. You don't need to do that for Georgia Tech. But what you do need to do is say, I want to push rigor when I can, but I also need to know that I have a balanced schedule and I can still maintain my grades, my sanity, my health, my balance extracurricularly. So we evaluate students in context, and this is how we think about them. Of course, we also care about the grades that you're earning in your classes. So we look at this. This student obviously has pretty much all A's. She has a few B's. That's okay. That doesn't keep her out of a highly selective college. You don't need to be perfect. There is no perfect, right? We just want to make sure you can do the work and you're challenging yourself appropriately. So that's how we evaluate transcripts. Now, that is the biggest part of your academic evaluation at any college, highly selective or not. Studies show that your transcript, your performance in high school, is the most predictive of your success in college. So we rely most on that. But another part of the conversation when it comes to academics is standardized testing. So standardized testing, as we all know, is a big facepalm. We hate it because it adds a lot of stress. It doesn't necessarily predict how well you're going to do in college. And luckily, many schools are doing away with requiring the SAT or the ACT. So during COVID, we know that basically all colleges and universities went test optional, but now we're in a space where we have some schools have brought back their testing requirements. So MIT, Georgetown, many public institutions in the Southeast, they require SAT or ACT. So this will be an important part of the process for some of you. Many schools are test optional, which means you have the option. You may submit testing if you think it will help you. You may choose not to if you don't want to. It is totally up to you. And then there's test free, which means we will not consider testing even if you want to submit it to us. You also might hear this be called test blind. So the University of California system, University of Washington. So there's lots of testing confusion out there. And my advice to you is, when we are evaluating applications, we look at you in the context of what our school's policies are, right? So if you are at a test optional school. So I worked at Swarthmore during the COVID pandemic. We went test optional. We were a school that previously required testing, but then we went test optional. So for students who didn't submit testing, we didn't hold it against them. Guess what we did? We went to that transcript. We looked at all those things I just talked about, and we said, great, do we think they can do the work or not? Yes or no? And we moved on with our evaluation of other parts of the app. But for students who did submit testing, we looked at, okay, what are the test ranges of students that we're typically admitting? So you can find this for pretty much any school out there. Just Google Swarthmore admitted student profile or admitted student SAT or ACT. That's how you find this information. And so at SWAT, you're going to see these numbers and they are very high. So let's say you took the ACT and you got in the mid 20s. That's not objectively a bad score, and you should not feel bad about that score. But if you're looking at, should I submit this to Swarthmore, that is pretty far below our middle 50%. So that means 50% of the students who submitted the ACT scored between a 32 and a 35. So if your score is well below our profile, it might hurt you in the application process. Now, if your score is a 34, that is solidly in the range of students that we typically admit. So that could be very safe and it could add value to your application. But here's the thing about testing. Just like we evaluate your transcript in context, we also evaluate your testing in context. So here's a little case study of two very different schools. Lynbrook is a very well-resourced, high-powered public school in the Bay Area of California. Juneau Douglas High School is my lovely, beautiful, charming alma mater in Juneau, Alaska. And you're going to see, we might have students applying to Swarthmore from both schools, but their test scores might look really different. So if you just compare these really quickly, I highlighted first the SAT. So you can see the average SAT score at Lynbrook is a 1438, whereas JDHS, it's a 1051. That's really different. So let's say I'm an engineer, I'm applying to Swarthmore and I have a 522 math. That's average from my high school of JDHS. But at Lynbrook, if I saw that you applied with a math score of 522, I would look at this profile and say, okay, your math score is pretty far below the mean, pretty far below what's typical at Lynbrook. So we evaluate you in the context that you're coming from. You look at the ACT, same thing. Lynbrook's average is around 32. JDHS is around 24. Big discrepancies. And then the other thing is when you're thinking about, okay, well, what about numbers of AP tests or classes, things like that? You can see that Lynbrook students, the vast majority, 9 out of 10 of their students who take APs pass an AP. Whereas at JDHS, it's only about half of the students who take APs even pass the test. So that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to get into Swarthmore if you apply with a 522 math, but it means that we're going to think about your test scores very differently than we would a Lynbrook student. So just remember, everything is in context. That's what our job is as admissions officers to understand, but you need to do the research for your schools to say, okay, who are the students that they're typically admitting, and decide what you want to put forward to them as you go. So academics, a huge part of this process, but particularly as schools get more selective, it is certainly not the only thing that we look at. So now we want to talk to you about extracurriculars. So I'm going to kick it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Brenna. So I'm going to take over and talk about extracurriculars and the role that they play in your application and admission candidacy. But before we jump into that, I want to talk about the word extracurriculars because I think that can be kind of misleading and silo your thinking into that it has to be organized or named, when really what we're talking about is more broad in activities. And that is actually what the section on your application will be called, where you enter in extracurriculars, activities, how you spend your time. So debunking that myth right off the bat, extracurriculars is more inclusive of really how do you spend your time. So what matters and how will that, how you spend your time, be evaluated in the long run of your application. So I'm going to start with a story, and it's about a student that I worked with. And when I asked, how do you spend your time? His response was, well, I play video games. And some of you listening, I know in the poll, there are a lot of parents. This might hit home for you. Probably had a reaction to, oh, well, I just play video games. And if the student were to put that on their application, activity, video games, I play them, that leaves it open to a lot of interpretation, positive, negative, whatever that reader might have. It doesn't tell us very much. And so as his counselor, I dug a bit deeper, right? You start asking questions about, well, why do you play video games? What is it that playing video games gives you or teaches you? What have you learned from this activity that you spend a lot of time doing? And that's when we uncovered, right, that through video games, he gets to think creatively and problem solve in ways that he doesn't get to at school. He's built this diverse, broad community of other gamers that he wouldn't have met otherwise. And it's a space where he's felt most comfortable pushing himself, right? Going out of his comfort zone. And all of that turns into a much more compelling story that we learn more about him as a student, and we're able to include and focus on in his application. So how you spend your time outside of the classroom and homework isn't as important as why it is that you are doing the things that you are doing. Now, when it comes to extracurriculars in the holistic sense of admissions review, why it matters, Brenna kind of touched on it already, you aren't just a student when you go to college, right? Like going to college, being a college student is a way of life. And colleges are trying to build community as much as they are trying to build, smart thinkers and contributors in the classroom. So the things that you are doing outside of the classroom now are important indicators of what kind of community member and contributor you will be in college. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do the exact same things, but it's the best example, right, of like what you're doing now and how that may play out in your college experience as well. Students with strong activities lists, the ones that stand out in an application review process, are ones who have chosen clear, intentional activities, right, where they are able to tell stories and speak to their motivations for doing those activities with passion and authenticity, and ones that help you find the dots, connect the dots to what you're doing now and what you hope to do in college. So pieces of advice for building an activities list that stands out. First is that colleges are intentionally limited or limiting in how many activities you share. On the Common Application, which is the most widely used application across colleges and universities in the United States, you have 10 spots to talk about your activities. And that is not a lot of space. And you might have way more than that, and you might have less than that. So to be strategic and to make sure that you are getting all of the most important information across about what you've done and why you've done it, it's important to prioritize. So at the top of that list, think about what activities have had the most impact on you as a person, and where you have had the most impact on that activity. List those first, right? So if an application is crossing the admission reader's desk and it's the 30th of the day, they're going to focus on the most important things at the top of that page, and you're not going to get lost in that shuffle. The most important activities to you are going to be at the top. The other thing that is limited on your activities list is usually how much space you get to describe that actual activity. So on the Common Application, you have 150 characters to describe that activity. And it is a missed opportunity for the majority of students. Now, Ashley said earlier, right, the common admission officer is a white woman in her 20s or 30s. But I'd also add to that they are college educated and fairly smart. So they don't need you to tell them what it means to be in biology club or on a basketball team or any other like logistical facet of the activity. Use what limited characters you have on your activity list to tell us more about you and your participation in that activity than what the activity actually is. If at all else fails and an admission officer reads an activity list and they don't know what you're talking about, they'll just Google it. They want to ultimately learn more about you, who you are and what's important to you, and not necessarily like what the cooking club does every week. So activities lists, if Brenna's comments about the academic section of your application was all about taking everything in context. Extracurriculars, it's really about meaningful, intentional storytelling behind how you are spending your time. If we carry this same sentiment of being meaningful and doing strong storytelling into another component of our application process, that would be essays. Essays are a part of this process that I think hold a lot of stress for students. And I get it, right? This is the one place in your application that is purely you. It's your voice. It's not filtered through anyone else. It's not a part of your application that is supposed to be talking about you, but isn't actually you. Your essays are a part of your application, an important part, but I'm also going to drop a little truth bomb on you because it's been referenced a couple of times already tonight, but admissions officers are reading a lot of applications every day, day on end for months. And the reality is that an admissions officer is probably going to read your personal statement, your main application essay, in 3 to 5 minutes. And read is probably more like skim, and 3 to 5 minutes is probably generous at some institutions. And I say that not to scare you, but to hopefully relieve some of the pressure that I think students feel about making sure their essay is perfect, that every word is exactly the right word, and that they, have taken every opportunity, right, to convey everything about them that they need to in this essay. Your essay is a part of this overall holistic application. It's an important part, like I said, and there are ways that you can control and maximize the role that it plays in your application. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, please don't stress out about it too much. So how do you make your essay stand out in such a short period of time? Well, the first thing is when I work with students and when our students work with our team of editors at Collegewise, because applications are being read and consumed so quickly, one of the most important things you can do is have a very clear message and articulate that message with efficiency at the beginning and ending of your essay, right? So if you're skimming, the things that are going to stick with you are the things that you read first and the things that you read last. And I hate conclusions. Conclusions are hard. You've just worked so hard on all of the other parts of that essay. You get so much more space to do that beautiful storytelling. And then you're supposed to just sum it all up in a way that doesn't end up being cliche or trite. And they're hard, but the conclusion of your personal statement is probably the most important part of it. So really think about what it is that you are trying to leave that reader with. What is your message? And communicate that clearly. Now, how are you going to decide what message you should be sharing? One of my favorite pieces of advice for students, if they're still thinking about what that message should be, is to go to the people in your life and ask them to tell you a story about you. What is the thing that comes to mind, right, when they are trying to tell somebody about who you are? Those stories often turn into really great, important traits about who you are that admissions officers are going to want to know. For example, my little brother, when he was little, loved playing dress up. He would dig through a suitcase of costumes and wear a different one every single day. It was just who he was. It cracked us up, and it is a story that I tell to this day, right? That he just loved playing dress up. And now, as an adult, he works as a cast member at Disneyland, where that same sort of entertainment, fun-loving, wanting to be the center of attention is now part of his career, right? Where he's building this magic for people at Disneyland. So the stories that the people in your life tell about you often turn into the very important things that you are going to do in college and beyond. The other piece of advice I have for you is to make sure that you are using your own voice when you are telling your essay. Lots of students fall into the trap of speaking in a way or telling a story in a way that they think an admissions officer is going to want to hear. But when you try to be something that you're not, and when you try to sound like someone that you are not, your reader's going to lose interest really fast. And it's doing you a disservice. So another piece of advice is to read your application out loud, or read your essay out loud. If you are stumbling over words or sentence structure, if it's not coming out naturally for you, you're probably leaning too far into writing in a way that is not sincere or authentic to your voice. The Collegewise advice is Make sure your essay is something that you could read and talk through with your favorite teacher at school, right? It balances that formality of college writing, but also sounding personal. So that's the zone, the tone that you are aiming for with your personal statement and sharing your voice. Now, your personal statement is one aspect of writing in your application, but the other aspect are the supplemental essays. Some colleges have them in their application, some do not. And the aspect of supplemental essays that I think is really important to focus on is that colleges are asking them for a reason, right? So if a college has makes the effort to ask an additional question or potentially multiple additional questions, they are telling you something about what they believe in, who they are, what kind of students they are looking for. Don't miss the opportunity to show that you have done your research and that you are a good match for that school based off of the prompt that they are giving you. Generic answers are not going to help in the long run. And you know what's really not going to help is if you leave information about another institution in that school's response. I've seen it happen a billion times when I was reading applications. I'm sure my co-presenters have as well. Really not a good look. So be detailed, do your research, really think about what message the prompt is sending you about what kind of school you're applying to, and then answer that prompt sincerely and show that your values, your interests and opinions align with the schools. That's it for me, and I'm going to pass it over to Ashley to round us out with letters of recommendation.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I'm going to talk about letters of recommendation and how those are reviewed in the process. And then we are each going to tell you how we reviewed applications within the context of the schools where we were at too, representing different types of schools. So you can look forward to that after the letters of recommendation. And we wanted to talk about this because this is the part of the process that you may feel like you don't have any control over as a student. What is written in my letter of recommendation? I have no idea what's going to happen because I'm not writing it, but you actually do have quite a bit of control over the relationships that you will build with your recommendation writers. And that is why starting to think about this early, even in 9th and 10th grade, can be really strategic and important to not only have strong letters, but to maximize your high school experience. Letters of recommendation are another part of the process that, if we say it once, we will say it 1,000 times, are read within the context of your high school. Within a large public high school, like the ones here in Atlanta, down the road from me, where there are 1,500 students in the school, and they have school counselors who have 500 students each, and then they've got chemistry teachers that have 25 students per class. What the colleges understand is that those counselors and teachers have a lot on their plates, and writing these letters, while they want to do a very good job, it is not the most important priority for them. And they're not looking for the letters to be incredible accounts of tons of personal anecdotes and beautiful stories about the students. Sometimes that exists, don't get me wrong. There are great letters that we saw come from public high schools, but I just want you to not feel the pressure that they have to be there. If you are at a large public high school where you think, well, I don't really know my school counselor, and so is that going to hurt me? I want you to know it depends on the high school you're at and how strong the letters typically are coming from that high school. On the other end of the spectrum, there are smaller independent and private schools that have full-time college counselors who literally within their job description, it says that part of their job description is to write a strong letter of recommendation for every single senior that graduates from that high school. And that was my job for many years, was writing those letters for every senior that graduated to make sure that colleges understood the context of the class, where the student lived within that class, how they fit into the fabric of the high school. So you can see that from one school, they're going to lean into those letters a lot for what they want from the letters, to be able to see how strong the students are and what kind of presence they took up within the school. And from some schools, they're not going to put as much pressure there, and they're going to look more to the essays and activities for the evidence of how the students will behave within their school once they get there. So a few things to think about with letters of recommendation is that the best letters, or really any letter that I saw in admission, was always somewhere from on the scale of this student is satisfactory to this student is once in a lifetime amazing. They were very rarely on this other side of unsatisfactory and less. And if that was the case, I mean, it was maybe 2 or 3 a year that said, I don't know why this student had me write their letter. They never came to class. They were disrespectful. That almost never happened. They were always kind of, this student participated in class and was fine, up to, I'm bursting through this letter to tell you how amazing this student is and the incredible anecdotes about them. A piece of advice to take away is that the best letters give personal anecdotes and stories that show the student within context. And so the only way teachers and counselors, no matter the size school, can put those into your letter is if they know you. And so this is where you get to have control over your letters of recommendation, by getting to know your teachers and seeing them as real people. I always wrote better letters for students that I knew better because I had stories to pull from. When I was sitting and writing their letter, often in the middle of the summer, I was thinking, oh yeah, Sarah came by and she was telling me about that card tournament she loved. And so I could pull out those cute details about a student's life that they might not even realize made it into a letter that really made their letter shine. So if there's anything you can do this week, go talk to your teachers, ask them what they're doing this weekend, ask them what they're looking forward to this summer, get to know those details because they want to know them about you too. And now we're going to pass it back to Brenna to talk about highly selective admission committee.
Okay, so I'm gonna go through and give you really high level how applications reviewed in the particular context of the most highly rejective colleges in the country, right? Think places like the Ivies, MIT, Stanford, the UCs to some extent, though their application process can be a little bit different. And generally, when we say highly selective admissions, we're talking about any school with a 20% or under admit rate, but also, you know, many of us go to these schools with under 10% admit rates. That's what we think of. But just know when we talk about this in the industry, really any school under 20 is highly selective for everyone applying. So here's the deal with highly selective admissions, right? We do all the things that I talked about, that my colleagues talk about. That's kind of conceptually how we're thinking about students holistically, right? It's the buzzword that you hear all the time. What that means is no one part of your application is going to get you in or keep you out. No one part is more important than the others. Yes, you have to clear the academic bar. Can you do the work? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you will not be considered for MIT. You will not be considered for the Ivies, right? You will not be considered for Swarthmore. But the reality is that the vast majority of students who apply to even the most rejective colleges in the country, they pass that bar. They can do the work. So really the decisions are made about everything else in your application in relation to the rest of the students applying. And that's the deal. So we look at you in context with your academics. Who are you? Where are you coming from? What opportunities broadly have been afforded to you in your life? And what have you done with that academically, socially, extracurricularly? Who are you and where are you going to fit in our community? So that's what really holistic means. I want to do a little framing here though, regarding the academics and that point I made. Let's give you some context. So a lot of people are like, okay, I need to be valedictorian, right? I need to get perfect SATs. You showed me those scary statistics. But here's the reality is that there are about 34,000 high schools in the United States alone. And if you look at the entire Ivy League, their incoming class combined is under 15,000 students. So even the entire Ivy League could not take every valedictorian in this country. So being a valedictorian is great. If you are the class president, that's amazing. You should be proud. No one can take that accomplishment away, and it will help you no matter where you go to college, but it will also not help you stand out in the most highly rejected colleges in the country. That's just the reality. The people who apply to these schools, at MIT, it is very common to see perfect scores and perfect grades. And that's most of the pool. So what the decisions really come down to is, okay, you can do it, but who are you? What type of human being are you going to be on our campus? Where are you going to contribute extracurricularly? What type of roommate are you going to be? Are you a nice person? I cannot overstate how important personality is in the highly rejective admissions process, because we have tens of thousands of applicants from all over the world to choose from. And what we're doing is not trying to choose the best, is trying to choose people who are different from one another so we can craft a really intentional class based on our specific university's needs, goals, and vibe. I say vibe a lot to my students and they're like, what do you mean vibe? And I'm like, Swarthmore has a real social justice vibe. We want students who are out there protesting, trying to change the world. MIT, unsurprisingly, has a very nerdy STEM vibe. I want to use science and technology to make the world a totally different place. So we want students who are going to fit in with that, but there is no one perfect student. And so we think about our institutional goals and priorities, which someone asked a good question. What can you give some examples of those? So those are things like sports teams, right? We need people to play on our baseball team if we have one. We need musicians to play in our orchestra. We want students from all 50 states and from all over the country. We want students who are first in their family to go to college. We want students who are interested in, niche hobbies like bird watching or weaving or playing the harp. And we want students who are going to be student body presidents and who are going to join our student publications and newspapers, right? So there is no way to predict, here is the formula. Obviously, we would all be millionaires if we could do that. Someone would have cracked the code. But the reality is, my advice for you, if you're sitting here and you're like, great, I hear that, I don't know what will make me stand out, is to do the things in high school that truly fill you up because you enjoy them. And if you do that, if you are like, I love this, I'm going to go deep in this thing I love, I am going to create community, I am going to support people in my high school, those are the qualities that shine through. And then colleges will craft their own individual classes based on what they need. But a lot of these things you will have no control over, right? You have no control if some alumni donated millions of dollars for a new engineering building that's going to be built in a few years. So maybe the college is like, hey, we're going to admit some more engineers this year. You're not going to be able to know things like that. So it's important for you to just lead with what you can control, which is your 4 years in high school. So that's how we read in highly rejective admissions. We pretty much only admit students in the fall. Many highly rejective schools do not consider students' finances. So that's called a need blind admissions process. So they don't give an advantage to students who can pay versus students who don't. And they don't think, many of these places don't give merit scholarships. So they're also only evaluating you for admission to their university. They're not thinking about giving you a scholarship based on your grades or scores because everyone has really strong grades and scores. So that's highly selective. But again, that is a small, tiny sliver of schools out there. So I'm going to move on to the majority of schools, which are slightly less selective.
Thanks, Brenna. So because of my Georgia Tech experience, I will be talking about selective public schools. And then I'll also dial it down and just talk about general public school admission as well. And the truth about some public schools is they are just as selective as what Brenna just described. So if we're thinking a UVA, a Berkeley, a UNC, those are very selective schools, and they are going to have as holistic of a process trying to fill institutional priorities as any other selective private or Ivy League school. But one of the big institutional priorities that rises to the top in a public school admission process is in-state balance versus out of state. And in many states, there are mandates for how many in-state students must be taken. So in North Carolina, we have a mandate. In Texas, they have the 6% law, and I won't get into all of those in the interest of time. But I think that that is what's really important to understand for you if you are looking at schools out of state that are public, to understand that many of those spots are going to be prioritized for in-state students. And what that looked like in practice is in a selective public school like Georgia Tech, we read students in the same way that was described earlier in the context of their high school, but we had a different standard for students from Marietta, Georgia than we had from Palo Alto, California, and from New Jersey and from Indiana. Those students had to reach a different level of academic accomplishment to be competitive in our process. So that responsibility really was to our in-state students to fill most of our class with them, because their parents are the ones paying taxes to fund much of the school. We did have some different things we were thinking about in selective public school admission. Like we might think, would this student be good to come for our summer term? Or maybe they could start in the fall, or maybe we could have them start in the spring. We had a little bit more creativity there. Or some other public schools I've seen have bridge programs where they will recommend that students go to a community college for the first semester and then roll right into being a full-time student in the second semester. So you're going to see more of that kind of flexibility on the public school side, where they also may have some guaranteed transfer programs between their public school system as well. And the nice thing about public schools is that their processes are often very public for you. So here's an example. Here in Georgia, if you want to go to most public schools that we have, there is a document that tells you exactly what you need to go. So if you want to go to Georgia Highlands College, you've got your minimum 2.0 and the required high school curriculum, you're in, boom, perfect. Once things get a little bit more selective, they might say, okay, to go to Georgia Southern, you have to have this test score and a slightly higher GPA, but there's still nothing else that you have to submit to go to Georgia Southern. But then as you can imagine, once you get to Georgia Tech, they don't have this guaranteed minimum that you need to make to get in. And then you can go to the Georgia Tech website to read more about what their selective holistic admission process looks like, which is then what we've been describing today. So hopefully this gives you a sense of how things might be a little bit different with public schools. And the nice thing is, if you're looking at public schools, oftentimes there's a lot of data available on the university website of the state for what it takes to get into those schools. So now I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin to wrap up with moderately to less selective holistic processes.
Thanks. So I want to lead off by saying moderately to less selective admissions does not mean that the school is less than. There are actually the majority of colleges and universities in the United States fall into this moderately to less selective admissions category. They are educating future leaders and change makers and extraordinary people. And I get to bring the highly selective and more rigid and also mysterious process that has been discussed previously back into reality a little bit. So I myself attended one of these moderately selective institutions and then proceeded to work in admissions there for a decade. And when I read applications, I got to say yes more than I said no. And it was one of the best parts of my job. We read applications with an eye to really getting to know the student, understanding them, taking things into context, learning about their stories, hopefully learning about them in person, and in a personal way, right? Building opportunities to form relationships with these students before they're even enrolled at our institution. And that context, that understanding of who the human is, understanding their goals and their aspirations and their fit for our institution, and then being able to say yes and give them the opportunity to visualize themselves on our campus. It was such a blessing, right, in the work that I got to do. And that is what the majority of college admissions happens in the United States. The media, the conversations that you hear in the grocery store or in the school pickup line, wherever it might be, focuses on a small piece of the puzzle. But I want to wrap up this webinar, because we are out of time, almost out of time, by saying that you will ultimately have a school that wants you, and where you can be successful. They are out there. Your application will be read with that lens, and hopefully all of the information, all of the advice that we've given today helps you navigate this process with a little less stress, and find that place where you're going to be most successful.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin. So I just launched a poll before you all sign off. We are finishing up the Q&A. Thank you for your amazing questions. Remember, you will get a recording of this webinar. We have lots of information online. We have lots of free resources. And if you would like more information, just learning about what we do at Collegewise, all of us who spoke to you are counselors. We work with many, many students to help break these things down on an individual level and give individual advice. I know we had a lot of questions in there that are a little specific, and we will not give that advice over webinars because that's not good counseling. We need to know our students really well. So if you do want to reach out, you can answer this poll. One of our colleagues will be in touch, and then you can get more information about what we do here. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. You all are amazing. You can all go to college, hang in there. And thanks for coming. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.